Ok, bueno, muchas gracias a todos y todas por venir. Es un gran gusto para nosotros darle la bienvenida a Jim Mahoney. Jim Mahoney, como muchos saben, es profesor de Sociología y Ciencia Política en Northwestern University. Es una autoridad en el campo de la metodología de investigación, particularmente de metodología cualitativa. Tiene una cantidad enorme de publicaciones de gran relevancia, artículos, libros, etcétera. Su libro más reciente es The Logic of Social Sciences, y otros de sus libros incluyen Comparative Historical, Advances in Comparative Historical Analysis, A Tale of Two Cultures, Qualitative and Quantitative Research in the Social Sciences, Colonialism and Post-Colonial Development, Spanish-American Comparative Perspective, and Explaining Institutional Change, Ambiguity, Agency and Power, entre otros, ¿sí? El día de hoy, Jim Mahoney nos va a presentar su proyecto de investigación más reciente, A Conjunctural Theory of Political Revolutions. La charla va a ser en inglés. So, Jim, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you so much, Rodrigo, for that very kind introduction. And it's wonderful to see you. Today, I will try to develop a conjunctural theory of political revolutions and talk about it a bit. And I'm really excited to get feedback and comments, because this truly is work in progress that can be adjusted and revised and changed as needed. This is The Logic of Social Science. One of the features of this book is it has chapters that were co-authored with other people, and two of the chapters are co-authored with Rodrigo, as well as some other people that went through graduate school at Northwestern. And the methodology and the approach in this book is reflected in the theory of political revolutions that I'll be developing today. The theory is an application of the ideas in the logic of social science. In some ways, is what this project is doing is it's kind of moving us from the study of social revolutions to the study of political revolutions. And by social revolutions, I mean Skocpol's definition. She says, social revolutions are rapid changes in a society's state and class structures. Social revolutions are accompanied by and in part carried through by class-based revolts from below. And there's not many social revolutions. Even this list, cases like Ethiopia and Cambodia have controversy around them. But there's around 10 social revolutions in modern world history, and that is it. I want to study what Skocpol called political revolutions. And she talked about political revolutions a little bit, but didn't have a theory of political revolutions. And in fact, there's not any theory of political revolutions out there as I define political revolutions. And for me, political revolutions are rapid and fundamental changes in the political organizations and institutions of a sovereign country. And they specifically entail the transformation of the national government policy orientation, the national political regime, and the central state apparatus, the military, the legal system, the administrative apparatus. However, unlike social revolutions, political revolutions do not fundamentally transform class structures. And most importantly, political revolutions leave the economically dominant class intact. In the midst of all of the political changes, the economically dominant class remains basically the same. I'm trying to come up with a list of political revolutions. And it's hard because there's a number of cases that are kind of borderline political revolutions, just as there are with social revolutions. We all know that our concepts, some cases fit our concepts nicely and are full members of our concept, but other cases are more partial members. They don't fit in so nicely. And so just take a second and look at this list and think about the cases that you think are a little shaky and a little dubious, and make a mental note to ask me about them, or let me know that you think that they're not great examples of political revolutions. And I'm also very eager to get additional cases that I've missed. In principle, I would love any political revolution since the 1600s to the present. I would like to put on this list. These are the candidates that I've been able to think of, and just reading about other regions and knowing something about Latin America. But I'm aware that some of these cases are really partial political revolutions. And again, this is the way I think categories work. Some cases are full members of categories, some cases aren't members at all, and some cases have degrees of partial membership in the category. And you'll note that this list of political revolutions has the revolutionaries as really interesting people, like Hitler or Bache in Uruguay or Nelson Mandela in South Africa. It's a very diverse group that's leading these political revolutions. And you'll also notice that the political revolutions, the revolutionaries come to power in different ways. Sometimes it's from below via insurrection, sometimes it's via military coup, and sometimes it's via elections and using existing regime institutions. And I'll come back to that point. We like to define things formally because we're methodologists, and so we do. This is the definition of political revolution. It has three positive components and the absence of one condition. It's a rapid government policy change, rapid regime change, rapid state change, and not rapid dominant class change. And that's a political revolution. And my view of things is that A, B, C, and D or not D, can be partially present. And if they are partially present, when I aggregate up to political revolution, you only get a partial political revolution. So I'm quite interested in not only whether A, B, C, and not D are present, but the degree to which they're present, or to state it more precisely, the degree to which actual countries have membership in these constitutive categories. So that's the straightforward classical definition of political revolution as I'm using it. Now the theory, this is a regular theory in the sense that it's a group of concepts and relationships that are used to explain a phenomena, and the phenomena is political revolutions. And I am suggesting that they occur when domestic political struggles against vulnerable regime states become intertwined with global ideological struggles over how to organize and use state power. And so political revolutions, I see them as emerging from the spatio-temporal intersection or conjuncture of two processes. There's a domestic political struggle involving challenges to a vulnerable regime state. And there's an international struggle between competing global political ideologies that enters domestic politics and shapes the conflict. There's lots of different ways you can think about how to build a theory of revolution or a model of revolution. I think a very generic way to theorize revolutions is to propose that you go from the state of no revolution to the state of revolution by virtue of some motor force that is making the action happen. And via process and agency, you get to a revolution. And I have these structural conditions here. And the way I think of structural conditions is they can block the movement to political revolution. In this example, the structural conditions are permissive. The window is open. It's possible to go through to political revolution. But if the structural condition was different, it would block movement and close off the political revolution. That's just kind of a generic model of political revolution. We could take a theory of revolution like Samuel Huntington's theory of revolutions and run it through that generic model. For Huntington, revolutions were driven by modernization. And modernization caused societal mobilization and discontent. And in Huntington's theory, the key condition was whether or not there were effective political institutions, especially effective political parties. If there were, that would block the revolution. But if there weren't, then that modernization would breed the discontent and you would get the revolution. And so for Huntington, the key was to have strong political institutions to stop the instability that would lead to revolutions. You could take a neo-Marxist theory and do something similar. If Marxism, the modernization happens in the form of technological advancement or the spread of capitalism, which drives class conflict, which will lead to revolution if structural conditions are open and permissive. And different Marxists had different ideas about structural conditions. For example, Lenin thought that the colonies blocked revolution. They stopped the class conflict that would lead to revolution. And they kind of gave Europe extra resources that Marx and Engels did not foresee. And so that was Lenin's big structural condition. Here's my conjunctural theory of revolutions presented schematically. And over on the far left, we have this global ideological cleavage that's entering domestic politics. And I'll say more about what these global ideologies are. And down here, we have a systemic legitimacy crisis for the old regime state. And so the old regime state is vulnerable, it's in trouble, it's not legitimate. There's a global ideological cleavage that enters this conflict that leads us to a revolutionary situation. The revolutionary situation, the revolutionaries, ideologically motivated revolutionaries, will come to power if certain domestic, structural, and international conditions are permissive. And I'll have specific ideas about these domestic structures and international conditions. And once you have the revolutionaries in power, there will always be a counter-revolution from supporters of the old regime state. That has to fail. International conditions have to be permissive. In particular, a great power can't intervene to stop the political revolution. And then if that's true, then we'll get a political revolution. So that's my model of revolution. And if we wanted to think of it as a set theoretic recipe, which of course we do, we could write it out as A and B and C leads to Y, where A is global ideological cleavage, B is systemic legitimacy crisis, and C is permissive structural conditions, and Y is political revolution. And what I'm going to do in the talk is I'm going to go over A, B, and C, kind of break them apart and go in depth on them. And that will be the kind of the main organizing device for the next 20 or 30 minutes. So let's start with A, global ideological cleavage. The idea here is that a political revolution occurs when political society is deeply divided by competing global political ideologies. I see ideologies as general, generic sets of beliefs that exist in international society. They're beliefs that tell actors how they should organize and use state power. And so actors who want to organize and use state power can use these available international or global ideologies. With a political revolution, the old regime state will be associated with one set of political principles. And with the revolution, the oppositional challengers, the revolutionaries, will be associated with a different set of political principles. I see this as a necessary condition for a political revolution. And so one way you know that you're headed toward a political revolution is if you have this kind of ideological cleavage. What are these global political ideologies? I'm going to suggest that there's 4 global political ideologies: liberalism, conservatism, anarchism, and socialism. Anarchism is going to drop out largely because it rejects the use of the state. And so it's hard to use this ideology to make a revolution because you need the state to make the revolution. I don't want the words liberalism and conservatism to become a hindrance to understanding what these ideologies are. For me, the ideologies are defined along 2 dimensions: approach to stratification an approach to authority. In stratification, you can either be a hierarchicalist or an egalitarian. With respect to authority, you can either be an individualist or a structuralist. And so really the ideology in this box is I'm using the word liberalism, but what it really is hierarchical individualism. Or in this box, I'm using the word socialism, but really the ideology is egalitarian structuralism. And that's a mouthful, and so I use these handy words. The problem with the handy words is they're associated with lots of other things. But this is how I'm defining these words, and this is what I mean by those words, exclusively this. Hierarchicalism versus egalitarianism. What's going on here is the question of, are human beings by their nature a hierarchical species that's competitive and that inevitably tends toward resource inequality and stratification? Or are human beings by their nature an egalitarian and cooperative species that lives best when resources are equitably distributed? And proponents of hierarchicalism, they reject the idea that human beings can really prosper under a truly equal society. They think human beings by their nature reject the homogeneity of full equality. And equality can only endure if it's artificially kept in place through repression. And so hierarchicalists, they seek to prevent government actions aimed at the unnatural redistribution of resources, believing that such efforts cause individuals and society as a whole to fall short of their potential. By contrast, egalitarians believe that inequalities in the possession of resources are generally unfair, unnecessary, and a hindrance to human flourishment. A fairly equal distribution of resources is required for human dignity and overall human well-being. On this view, severe inequality can only endure if it's artificially kept in place through the exercise of power by resource-rich actors who exercise domination over resource-poor actors. Proponents of egalitarianism believe that individuals and groups must work to redistribute resources as a basic matter of justice and fairness, as well as to create a good society. The second dimension is individualism versus structuralism. Here is what is kind of at stake is, are atomistic, autonomous individuals the primitive units of society, of social reality? Or are society's structures, its norms, and its technologies the primitive units of society? And individualists, they believe that individuals thrive when they're left free to make creative choices for themselves. Individuals must be protected from the constraints and regulations that others seek to place on their behaviors and their freedoms. Individualistic views on the appropriate role of the state allow for at most a minimal state that focuses on solving collective action problems and guaranteeing the rule of law. By contrast, structuralists believe that pre-existing social structures strongly and inevitably shape the beliefs and behavior of all individuals. On the structuralist view, individuals cannot solve societal problems without changing the social structures responsible for those problems. For structuralists, a strong state is necessary to rearrange social structural conditions in ways that allow human beings to live more harmonious, meaningful lives. And so there you have it. By cross-tabulating these two parameters, we arrive at these four ideologies, and I use these words to designate the four ideologies. The adoption and partially successful enactment of a new political ideology is a basic motor force of political revolutions. With political revolutions, you'll have an ideological division, and that division, it could overlap with economic or sociocultural divides in society, but it doesn't have to. And in fact, I will propose that the ideological division cannot be fully reduced to an economic or sociocultural division, that there's some autonomy of the ideology in this theory. We can roughly categorize revolutions according to whether they end up being liberal, socialist, or conservative revolutions. And this listing has both the social revolutions and the political revolutions. The social revolutions are listed in italics, and the political revolutions are not italicized. And so these are the ones that I'm calling the liberal revolutions. You can take a look there and see if you think these are liberal revolutions. These are the ones that I'm calling socialist revolutions with controversy, cases like Peru and under Velasco or Venezuela under Chavez. The conservative revolutions, you can see them listed here. And again, my kind of view of concepts is that real cases are often not full members of the categories. They're partial members. And so some of these cases only fit uncomfortably in these boxes. And figuring out why they fit uncomfortably in the boxes is really important to me, because I like to code cases as having partial membership in categories, partial set membership. The period from the American Revolution to World War I, or the French Revolution to World War I, was the era of liberal political revolutions. From World War I to World War II, there were a number of conservative revolutions. I note here that we may be witnessing a new era of conservative revolutions. If we look at cases like Turkey and the near miss in the United States, and we'll see what happens with the election in Brazil. And the period from the end of World War II to about 1990 was the era of socialist revolutions in the global South. And we now see these cases that are kind of socialist, like Chavez in Venezuela or Morales in Bolivia, where really is how I view them as they're anti-liberal. They don't like individualism and they don't like hierarchy. And so they're anti-liberal revolutions that kind of combine socialism and conservatism. And be curious to see if people agree that Venezuela and Bolivia are best viewed as anti-liberal revolutions, rather than say socialist revolutions or conservative revolutions. Okay, that's enough on ideology. Factor B is systemic legitimacy crisis. Here I'm arguing that political revolutions occur when a government regime and state are illegitimate for important groups within society and within the state. And important groups are important political parties, economic elites, mass members of society, a high percentage of politically aware people in society, and military officers. And the United States, I think, is experiencing a systemic legitimacy crisis insofar as the Republican Party believes that the Biden government is illegitimate, that the regime, the electoral system that elected Biden is also broken and illegitimate, and that the state, things like the intelligence agencies or the EPA and even the military leadership, is illegitimate. If that's widely accepted by the Republican Party and mass numbers of people in the United States, then a systemic legitimacy crisis exists in the United States. Revolutionaries inevitably must defeat counter-revolutionaries. And in order to do so, they need support from these important groups, including always mass supporters. Mass supporters, they will sustain a political revolution by engaging in combat, by protesting and exercising voice in support of the revolution, and or by voting for the revolutionaries in competitive elections. And the reason why the US didn't have a political revolution is that Trump did not decisively win the 2020 elections. If he had decisively defeated Biden by like 8 percentage points or something like that, the US was going down the road of political revolution. But the counter-revolution worked in that the Democrats and Biden won those elections. And we'll see what happens 2 years from now. Ultimately, revolutions do boil down to, if we look at this chart, the power of the revolutionary challengers and the power of the government. And this is a complicated chart, but what I'm arguing is that a systemic legitimacy crisis that has the effect of empowering the revolutionary challengers and weakening the government, the old regime state. And the US is experiencing a systemic legitimacy crisis. So far, it hasn't been strong enough so that the revolutionary challengers have been able to overpower the government. And that was proven because Trump lost those elections. But we'll see. If the systemic legitimacy crisis were to get substantially worse, again, I would predict political revolution in the United States. Okay, third condition is C, and here these structural conditions have to be permissive. And that's a nice slogan, but it doesn't have much content until you actually specify the specific kinds of structural conditions that can effectively block a political revolution. And if you go back to my earlier slide that summarizes my theory, structural conditions are like windows that need to be open for the revolution to happen. And if they're not open, they block the revolution, they stop it. There's three modes of political revolution. Again, these are categories, and real cases don't always fit them perfectly. But there's political revolutions from below, in which the revolutionaries primarily come to power through an insurrection via a civil war in which they militarily defeat the government on the battlefield and take power. There's political revolutions from above, which I define as a military coup. The military overthrows the old government, and it either takes power itself or it installs a new revolutionary government with a different ideology that then makes the revolution. And there's political revolutions from within. And these are revolutions that happen generally in systems with competitive elections, in which the revolutionaries come to power via peaceful election. And we may not even know that they're revolutionaries, or we may be uncertain that they're revolutionaries until they get in power and embrace and enact an ideology that contradicts the existing political system. And we can try to code the political revolutions according to whether they're from below, from above, or from within. And here I've done that. In some ways, I wish I had a handout so that everyone could scrutinize these cases and tell me which ones don't make sense and cases that I'm missing. But here you see them. And again, some of these cases are with controversy, like was the rise of Juan Perón to power in Argentina. Was that really a political revolution, a conservative political revolution from above? It's debatable. But this is the list. This is where I'm at this point in time with this theory and the empirics of it. I note here that all of social revolutions occur from below. Social revolutions always involve class-based revolts from below. There's always an insurrectionary component to social revolutions. And it's that class-based revolts from below that allow social revolutions to undermine the existing dominant class and institute new class structures. Political revolutions, the ones that could possibly do that would be the ones from below, but they don't undermine ultimately the dominant class. The structural conditions for these revolutions. In general, infrastructurally strong states will block revolutions from below. So you need an infrastructurally weak state to have a political revolution from below. The reason why these don't occur very much anymore is, in general, states have gotten infrastructurally stronger over time. And the military, in particular, of the old regime state is powerful enough that you can't defeat it. You're not going to overthrow the United States government via revolution from below. The military is just too powerful. Political revolutions from above is what you need here is a military that's relatively autonomous from the government. If the military is totally captured by the government of the old regime, you won't get a political revolution from above. And the military also has to be oriented toward internal security to get a revolution from above. Al Steppen famously just wrote about the militaries oriented toward external security versus those oriented toward internal security. If the military is professionalized toward external security, that will block a political revolution from above, because the military will view itself as as politics as being none of its business, and it should be subordinate to government. Finally, political revolutions from within. Now, the structural condition you need here is the revolutionary government needs to be able to use some existing political institutions for large-scale mobilization. And so you need a mobilizational regime to be in place in order to have a successful political revolution from within. Democracies are great for political revolutions from within because an actor like Trump or Bolsonaro or whoever can use those institutions to have mass displays of support for their government. Political revolutions from within are blocked in closed authoritarian regimes, personalistic authoritarian regimes that are hugely demobilizational, in which there's no institutions for large-scale mobilization. Under those circumstances, you can try to make a revolution from within, but you won't be able to mobilize the followers that you're going to need to defeat the counter-revolution. And so the counter-revolution will put you down unless you're able to draw on pre-existing political institutions that allow for large-scale mobilization. So those are the structural preconditions for revolutions from below, from above, and from within. I like to have these diagrams, and so for a revolution from below, you need to have a weak infrastructural power for the state, or not strong state infrastructural power. For a revolution from within, you need to have a mobilizational regime that's an enabling condition. And for a revolution from above, the military has to be autonomous and oriented toward internal security for a revolution from above. Now, another necessary condition for a political revolution is the absence of the overthrow of the revolutionary government by a powerful external state. And we all know of cases like, say, Guatemala in 1954 and so forth, in which potential revolutions have been overthrown by the United States, or in Africa, sometimes another more powerful country from abroad. And a key question when assessing external intervention is the ideological relationship between the domestic government, the revolutionary challengers, and geographically proximate great powers. And outside countries will react to the revolutionaries on the basis of their ideology. And so the United States purports to follow hierarchical individualism, liberalism. And liberalism completely contradicts socialism on both dimensions. And so the United States will always react negatively to socialist revolutionaries on the basis of their ideology. It also will frown upon conservative revolutionaries, but it won't hate them as much. And it will actively support liberal revolutionaries that are moving against socialist or conservative regimes. So international society reacts to revolutionaries and the old regimes according to ideology. And you need to avoid being overthrown by a powerful country from abroad. And I would say a permissive condition for a revolution is a great power that's ideologically opposed to the revolution. They can't easily intervene because they're either too far away, or their own domestic opposition makes it too difficult, or they're too preoccupied with other crises. You can get things like a quasi-socialist revolution in Peru under Velasco, because the US doesn't end up overthrowing it. And it doesn't overthrow it because it didn't view it as socialist enough, and it was preoccupied with Vietnam and other concerns. And so you're able to sneak through the land reform and some important reforms in Peru in '68, while the US is too busy with its own problems. So when and where is a political revolution going to happen? It's going to happen when political cleavages overlap with global ideologies. It's going to happen when a systemic legitimacy crisis exists for the current government and regime state. It's going to occur if the state is infrastructurally weak, or the military is politicized and oriented toward internal security, or where the regime is mobilizational and has mobilizational institutions. And it's going to occur where this permissive international context exists. That's where we should be on the lookout for political revolutions. Here's the slide again with the revolutions by ideology. I want to conclude by just saying a few words about each of these types of revolutions, the liberal revolutions, the socialist and the conservatives, and then open it up for the Q&A. The liberal revolutions. The old is what we find with the liberal revolutions is it's always the liberals are overthrowing a well-established conservative and authoritarian political system. And it's usually a well-known government or regime that gets displaced by the liberal revolutions. Benito Juarez's revolution in Mexico displaced Santa Anna and the conservative regime, and the Tokugawa regime in Japan was replaced by the Meiji reformers. Rafael Carrera in Guatemala, a conservative government was overthrown by Barrios and the liberals. Pinochet in Chile in 73, apartheid in South Africa. And so a lot of times the old regime state's quite interesting and quite well established that gets overthrown by the liberals. Second, the liberal revolutionaries turn out to be usually Western-oriented modernizers who basically sought to emulate the United States and/or Western Europe, or at least aspects of their political constitutions and political systems. Third, the liberals needed to use mass mobilization to take power and/or hold on to power. And so their ability to win power or defeat the counter-revolution once in power depended on mass mobilization. Also with the liberal revolutions, if the state was weak, the liberals, as a kind of a first choice, were pursuing revolutions from below. If that's not structurally possible, their next choice is revolutions from above. And if revolutions from above are not possible, then you pursue revolutions from within. So if you're a liberal revolutionary out there in wanting to displace your conservative regime state, this is kind of the logic you go through. Can we overthrow them from below? Can we use a military coup to displace them? Or do we have to do it kind of sneakily from within? Then finally, with the liberal revolution, support from Western countries turns out to be crucial for the success of the liberal revolutions. The United States and Europe often help to delegitimate the old regime state and actively support the liberal revolutionaries. The socialist revolutions. Most socialist revolutions were social revolutions, not political revolutions. And most social revolutions were socialist revolutions. And in the world of set theory, we say that there's high set coincidence. The set of social revolutions and the set of socialist revolutions almost perfectly overlap. I do think, though, that Peru, Libya, and Venezuela can perhaps be seen as socialist political revolutions from above. These revolutions were led by progressive and nationalistic army officers that rejected the United States eventually, and that sought to establish stable and personalistic authoritarian rule. And I think in Bolivia 2006, something similar is eventually happened under Evo with kind of an anti-liberal, quasi-socialist political revolution. I'm struggling with these cases, though. Third, the policies of these governments, and this is why I call them socialist, were both egalitarian and structuralist. They sought to redistribute resources to structurally disadvantaged groups, including indigenous people in the Latin American cases. Fourth, while these governments used and depended upon popular mobilization, these cases were not accompanied by large-scale class-based revolts from below, equivalent to what happened in the social revolutions. And so they're not social revolutions. Fifth, the fact that these governments did not completely attack and undermine the economic elite might explain why the United States did not take more actions to overtly intervene and destroy these political revolutions. And I'm curious to see what people think about that. Finally, the conservative revolutions. These are usually reactions to the failures and failings of liberal governments. And so the antecedent regime state is liberal. And conservative parties, they kind of view themselves as counter-revolutionary movements that are responding to the potential liberal political revolutions or the excesses of liberal governments. In Guatemala in 1844 and Colombia in 1886, conservatives organized peasant armies that defeated liberal armies on the battlefield. And in Italy and Germany, after World War I, fascists come to power through elections in opposition to liberal governments. And some version of that pattern seems to characterize Turkey since 2014. Some of the more successful radical populist experiences could be seen as conservative political revolutions, like Argentina under Perón, as well as, I think, at least one bureaucratic authoritarian case that destroyed a longstanding competitive, fairly close to full democratic political system, that is Chile. The conservative revolutions, the main threat to liberal democracy in our times, I think, is probably a conservative revolution from within. Like I said, Trump may have succeeded if he had decisively won the 2020 elections, and who knows, he still may. You know, it looks like Bolsonaro is going to lose in a landslide, but that's what it looked like last time. And so we'll see about Brazil. But that's also a worrisome case if Bolsonaro were to somehow win and Lula goes back to jail, or we'll just have to wait and see. Fourth, the popularity of anti-liberal conservatives is related to the shortcomings of liberalism, especially with respect to its tolerance for inequality and status hierarchy. I think liberals are vulnerable to conservative revolutions because of this tolerance for massive inequality and unequalness in status. It leads to a loss of dignity for people. And so I think liberals will always be vulnerable to potential revolutions from conservatives because of their hierarchicalism. Fifth, to prevent conservative revolutions in the short run, liberals can pursue two main options. They can decisively defeat conservative revolutionaries in elections. That's fine and well if you can do it, but if your government and regime and state are viewed as illegitimate, you'll have trouble doing that. And you can also prevent popular conservatives from running in elections by making their candidacy illegitimate, by imposing a scandal or corruption upon them to keep them out of office. I do think, sixth, the long-run solution is greater promotion of egalitarianism through wealth and status redistribution by left-leaning liberals. And so there my egalitarian roots come out. And I think left-leaning liberals are the right way to go because they'll avoid the mass status inequality that makes the system vulnerable to conservative revolution. So that's it. There's the theory in its schematic form. I've tried to flesh it out, and I'll be very interested in hearing your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Such a great presentation. I'm going to open the floor for questions. If you can raise your hand, your virtual hand, and I will give you the mic virtually. Okay, Jen.
I need to ask my question first because there was a lot of moving parts and I'm afraid I'm going to forget what I want to ask. This is a really comprehensive, as usual, as per sort of Jim Mahoney style, really comprehensive, really thought through, very sort of logically coherent, and a lot of moving parts. So some of my questions sort of emerged in earlier segments, and maybe you eventually responded to them, but I wanted to ask a couple of questions. So my first question is about, well, let's see. I got caught up thinking about, well, let's see, I'm gonna be short here because I'm sure there's lots of questions. So let me ask first about the opposition, sort of the revolutionaries in different scenarios. We don't really learn very much about them. And I was trying to think of sort of what they look like, how they're constituted, right? How it's constituted, right? So is it different if the opposition is represented by a political party versus a social movement, or a movement that turns into a party? I can imagine sort of opposition strength as a function of that, but key, at least for some of these types of revolutions, seems to be the extent to which there's a military element involved. And for example, it occurs to me in the case of the US, perhaps one of the reasons why the insurrection didn't work out is because the military ultimately sort of stood in line with sort of the status quo. But what does the opposition sort of look like? Does it matter how the opposition is constituted? That's my first sort of, I guess, my substantive question. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the Bolivia and Venezuela cases, because let's see, are they both revolutions from within? Is that how they're classified? I can't remember. I know the Bolivia case is a revolution from within. I can't remember what the Venezuela.
I called Venezuela from above. You know, it's complicated because Chavez originally came to power through a coup, but then there was elections, and so it's kind of in between those two. It's definitely, Venezuela is definitely not from below.
Well, so this is interesting to me because I would definitely say not from above, because there was an attempted coup and it failed, and then he was incarcerated, and then, you know, several years later he came about through elections. So, but maybe, and given some of the way you described the revolution from below, I could also see there's elements of that in the Venezuela case, because there's severe societal rejection of the status quo, the government, the parties, the state, in all sort of its sort of, to me, you don't see mobilizations, you don't see protests, but clearly citizens were rejecting the sort of two-party cartelized system and the democracy that that party system represented. And so that made perhaps the revolution from within a little bit easier. I don't know. I sort of just get caught up in the Bolivia case, because while Morales comes to power via elections, there is a lot of conflict and protest, and Sanchez de Lozada is forced out of power from essentially insurrections, from like protests from below, and he flees the country, and then you have these like 2 or 3 years of really sort of upheaval before we finally see sort of a new regime consolidated under Morales. And so I wonder if it makes sense to sometimes think of these political revolutions as happening sequentially. So first you have something happening from below, and then sort of the within component comes through as sort of like a second stage part of the revolution. And then why is it from within and not from above, right? And maybe there, if sort of society is ready for change, right? So that could be, you could call that an insurrection or not, but if they're ready for change, then why does it sometimes happen from within, and why does it sometimes happen sort of from above, right? And at any rate, it seems to me that there's more going on there than just restricting it to one type of revolution or another. And that sort of, at least for me, I would argue in the Bolivia case, it started off from below and became within. And what the good thing about the within part of it was that democracy was sort of consolidated versus any sort of democratic reversal, which you might have seen if, you know, once society was ready for change, it happened from above. Anyway, just sort of thinking out loud there, but thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. These cases are two of the tougher cases. You know, revolutionaries how are they constituted? Ultimately, the revolutionaries seek state power is what they're about. And they use ideology, you know, as part of that more fundamental interest of taking state power. And you know, they're a diverse group of people. Some of them wear suits, and some of them are, you know, in military uniforms, and some of them are in, you know, clothes from their insurrectionary army. And I think it's, you know, how the revolutionaries relate to the military and to mass followers is crucial. And that's, you know, a crucial part of how the revolutions play out. With revolutions from below, my image of those was the revolutionaries come to power via civil war, in which they defeat militarily the government in power. And that's how I'm kind of defining a revolution from below. And that doesn't seem, like it occurs very much anymore, because states are so strong that usually we don't attempt to, overthrow them. And when we do, the fate is more like it's a shining path than success, typically. But in the 19th century and early 20th century, that's how revolutionaries did come to power. It was on the battlefield by mobilizing their supporters and defeating the National Army in wars. So I wouldn't want to say Bolivia is a case of political revolution from below in that sense. I do think these cases of political revolution from within, the key thing is that they're able to mobilize mass followers. It's absolutely crucial that there's institutions that exist for them to be able to do that. And so even though the revolutions from within, they might start quietly and, almost unexpectedly, eventually it's going to come down to their ability to mobilize mass followers. And is what I'm proposing is that in certain regime situations, in particular closed authoritarian regimes, it's really hard to do that because the pre-existing institutions aren't there for that kind of mobilization. And so it's really hard for Morales to come to power because the old regime has been so closed and demobilizational during the period before. But you're right about Chavez being more within than from above, and ultimately, it is. Perón in Argentina is also another one of these ones that are confusing me. I guess maybe, well, I'm not sure. Maybe the more important distinction is whether it's from below versus the other two types, but maybe that's not right. I'm going to have to think about it more.
Okay, Karsten.
All right, great, thanks. This is very thought-provoking, transparent, and very ambitious. And so I was wondering, so your concept of a political revolution, so I understand the contrast with Skocpol's definition, but I was wondering, what do you think is the benefit of adopting such an extensive definition of what a revolution is that includes coups, transitions, insurrections, and social revolutions, right? It's a really big category with lots of things that you throw in there. And then related to this is like how you actually select your cases. And I was particularly wondering, like, what do you understand what a revolution actually is, right? Is it like a discrete moment in which the order is ruptured? Right? Is it a critical juncture or is it a process? Because if you look at, so in Mexico, you identify the Mexican case as 1856. So I guess this is the middle of the reformer laws and the later law, right? It's 56, but it starts earlier and it ends later, right? So it's kind of like right in the middle. And then with the Mexican case, just like as a parenthesis, I think, right, so Benito Juarez becomes president because he's in the constitutional line of succession as the president of the Supreme Court, right? So this looks very much to me like a revolution from within because there's an inter-elite conflict. And the leader that rises from within the institution. So I was wondering about this. But I think the more important point for me is the kind of like, is it a moment or is it a process? Because if you contrast Mexico, right, so the reform laws in Mexico, and there you exclude the counter-revolution, which would be the reform laws, wars. And then if you contrast this with Chile, so in Chile, for you, the revolution is 1973, right? So it's the counter-revolution there and not the preceding revolution that would be the land reform that starts in the 60s and then becomes radicalized during Allende. So why the Chile case it's 73 but not 70? And then I think my point becomes clear in the contrast with Mexico, where you seem to have taken the opposite decision.
Great questions, Karsten. Thank you. On the one hand, the definition of political revolution that I have has lots of different things in it. But on the other hand, it's very restrictive in that we don't end up with, in many cases, of political revolution at all. even the 25 that I listed, several of them, maybe as many as 15 of them have some controversy surrounding them. And you don't think that they quite make the threshold of political revolution. At least I don't. I think many of those are just partial political revolutions. And so, yes, on one level, it's a heterogeneous category, but on another level, it's a very restrictive category, because many political scientists will say a political revolution really is any insurrectionary movement or any protest movement that wants to take state power. And so I am following in the kind of Scotch-Polian tradition and I've always been curious about what causes these political revolutions. And the reason for studying them is they're the main threat in contemporary politics. Well, not threat isn't the right word. They're the main way in which massive, rapid political change is going to occur. Social revolutions, there hasn't been a clear-cut one since 1979. And so I think political revolutions, where the kind of the action is for rapid, dramatic political change. I do think they're processes. They have to, the revolutionary government has to be in power for a fairly decent period of time in order to make changes that we feel like are institutionalized. And I can't remember why I picked that date for Mexico. It might be because is that the date of the Constitution? I can't remember, but I might have just picked the date of the new Constitution that the Juarez and the liberals formulated. And it's tricky when you're going to pick 1 year for designated, whether it's a social revolution like the French Revolution or a political revolution. And it's even tricky though when you say it's a process and you have to pick a starting year and an ending year. And so it is complicated. I do think Mexico, that the liberals, and Juarez and those guys came to power in part because they were able to defeat the old regime on the battlefield. I think that if they weren't able to mobilize effective armies, and the United States helped them, they would not have been able to kind of come to power. So I view that liberal revolution in Mexico is from below. Allende would have been like maybe the only socialist revolution, from within in history. If he had been in power longer, we maybe would have had to rework our understanding of social revolution. But I view Allende as a failed social revolution, or a revolution, a social revolution that was in the making, that was defeated by external intervention and as well as the counter-revolutionaries. And then Pinochet comes to power and undermines the democratic regime that existed, and in many ways was kind of a hierarchical structuralist in his disposition. And because he was in power all the way till 1990, it seems like long enough to say that was a stable, real, substantial political entity, political animal. And so it's partly a question of duration. And the revolutionaries have to be in power long enough to make some fairly stable changes. And even cases like Hitler, or I worry, was he in power long enough, for that to be considered a political revolution? And somewhere like around 10 years or something is what's going on in my mind. If I had to come up with a quantitative measure, I might pick 10 years. They have to be in power.
Okay, Juan.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This is really a work in progress, and I don't want to get into the cases because, of course, you will have a difficult task ahead in terms of identification. But two things I like from your argument. I think you can at least challenge the idea of a critical juncture from there, and I think that's interesting for the field. It's more like a Stinchcombian kind of argument about continuity. And I think that if you develop that, it would be really interesting for the field, in which now the idea of critical juncture is all over the place. So that I think is interesting, and I think it's a potential. The other things, I mean, just for thinking, and without entering into the each case in particular, and I like the idea of Carsten about if it is the initial moment or it's the process. I think you think hard on that, because, for example, Bolsonaro, it's a case in which probably it's not the initial moment. Bolsonaro is not there because of himself, but perhaps in the process. But before that, is it revolution the right concept for all these processes, or you need to think maybe more in terms of more broadly in terms of political change or political disruption, or I don't know. I don't know, because on the one hand, you say elites accommodate themselves, and that's powerful. On the other hand, it's too broad for be a revolution. I'm not sure. But thank you very much. I like it, and it made me think a lot.
Thank you, Juan. I will take that as a very helpful comment about continuity and critical junctures. And yeah, political revolution, I'm trying to find cases in which there's a rapid, substantial political change of not only the government, but of the regime and the state, in which the political change endures long enough so that we feel comfortable calling it an institutionalized order. And that, for me, is a revolution. We need some way of talking about cases where the dominant class, the economically dominant class, stays in power. We need some way to talk about what Donald Trump might accomplish in the United States, and what Adolf Hitler accomplished in Germany, or what Juarez and the liberals accomplished in Mexico in the late 19th century, where there really is not only a rupture and a dismantling of what previously existed, but the building up of a new alternative. And for me, that's revolution. So I'm going to try to stick with that concept. But I do agree that some of these cases are only partial members of that category revolution.
Okay, Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Jim, this is great, and it's always very interesting to listen to you and see your work in progress. I have, like, just because you asked about the cases, I have one very short commentary about cases. I know that at some point you consider the Fujimori case in Peru, and I'm wondering why it's not longer maybe there, or why you consider that it's not even a partial revolution. But then, like, my main question will be, like, I would love if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more how you see your theory in contrast to Huntington's theory. And I'm asking this because, like, for example, when I see the condition that is the structural conditions that are permissive, as far as I see them, I understand that they are basically institutions. You're talking about the political institutions, you're talking about the state, you're talking about political parties. So I'm wondering if there is more overlap maybe there with Huntington, or more inspiration in Huntington. When there is a crucial distinction is, for example, when you talk about the other two conditions, right? The systemic legitimacy crisis and the ideological cleavage. But I think there is a fundamental challenge that claiming actually that they are separate, probably conditions from other conditions. For example, you mentioned that you see the ideological cleavage as distinctive from economic forces, right? But it kind of brings us to a fundamental unresolved and maybe unresolvable division in the social science between culture and structure. And so the question will be like, if ideas are movers, right, or causes of social change, can we really separate ideas from their holders? Like, can we separate ideas from power resources? Or can we separate ideas, for example, from economic classes or social organizations or political organizations that hold these ideas? And maybe something similar applies to the systemic legitimacy crisis that you mentioned as a second condition. So, well, I'm wondering how you will react to that.
Those are great thoughts, Danielle. Thank you for sharing them. I've gone back and forth on Fujimori. I don't know enough about the Peruvian case to really nail it down. The key thing is, what were the pre-existing political institutions, before Fujimori's auto coup, and what did Fujimori put in place? And I'm interested in, certainly one can argue it was a policy reorientation. Did the regime institutions change? And it doesn't have to go from like democracy to authoritarianism, but there should be basic transformation of the way in which the center of political power is organized and the way in which that center of political power relates to society. Was there something solid before that got dismantled and something solid that Fujimori put into place? And then second, did Fujimori undermine state institutions? Usually the military is one of them, but also other state institutions like intelligence agencies and civil service agencies. And that would be my question. And sometimes when I've read the case, I've thought, oh, this is a political revolution. I put it in and then I pulled it back out when I read something else. And I just need somebody like Rodrigo to tell me if Fujimori is a political revolution or not, and to explain to me it, under my definition, why it is or isn't, and what the issues are. I have a host of Latin Americanist graduate students, and they'll be working with me on specific cases over the next couple of years as I try to nail down what really is and isn't a political revolution. Danielle, on Huntington, you're right in that Huntington, in some ways, he was talking about revolutions, and that included political revolutions as well as social revolutions, I think. And his model has economic modernization kind of as the driver of revolutions. And I suppose one can almost always find economic modernization preceding a revolution, because there's always a sense in which the forces of modernization are acting upon societies. And I suppose one could, and probably people have tested to see if, in fact, there's more rapid growth before a political revolution or not. Certainly when I think of the political revolutions, some seem to be associated with rapid growth, but others are not, decisively not. And then, Huntington's master factor was if there's strong political parties. And, some political revolutions occur in the midst of strong political parties, and others occur in the midst of weak political parties. So I feel like his master variables, they're not so far. I'm not seeing the correlations that I would want to see, the associations that I would want to see. Is obviously is what needs to be done is every case needs to be coded according to certain factors. To what extent was there rapid modernization before the political revolution? Was it atypical rapid modernization? To what extent was the old political system marked by strong political parties? These are things that can get coded for every case and evaluated. And that's clearly something a direction that this project needs to go. And the nice thing is, insofar as I focus on positive cases of political revolution, there's maybe 25, right? And so it's doable. It's a manageable number of cases. It's actually very exciting to be working with a medium number of cases. Not many projects have that. And then finally, Danielle, you asked about ideas as movers and ideologies. And I mean, one of the things that I've always been struck by working on Latin America is kind of the colonial inheritance under the late Bourbon administrations. They really did introduce, broadly speaking, more liberal ideas into the colonies, and certainly in Mexico City or in Lima and Buenos Aires, you had merchants and other notables that were more liberal oriented. And so there is a certain sense in which Latin America emerges independent with two competing sets of ideas. Just as Spain had these same two competing sets of ideas of liberalism versus conservatism. And I did my first work on Central America, where those ideas were fought out in the Federation of Central America from the early 1820s to 1838. And there's a sense in which the Latin American trajectory was then for the liberals in one way or another to come to power, and for those ideas, those liberal ideas, to gain sway. And conservatism was forever altered in the sense that things like monarchy were no longer even sensible ideas. And so conservatism changed with the rise of liberals during the 19th century in Latin America. But there was a backlash against liberalism. A salient example is the Mexican Revolution beginning in 1910 and going till 1936 or whenever you want to end it. And there's other backlashes, though, of neoconservative, new conservative movements reacting against liberalism. And then meanwhile, the Russian Revolution happens and brings socialist ideas to the fore within kind of international society. And so you have this three-way clash between socialism, conservatism, and liberalism. And it certainly is going to fight itself out within the Latin American countries with advocates of each of those three. And as what we've witnessed since 1990 has been the decline of socialist ideas. The end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union has put the brakes on traditional socialist ideas. And I think what's going on is we're now seeing like neo-socialist ideas in the same way that conservative ideas of the past with monarchies and where republics are denied is no longer feasible. I think some of the old socialist ideas will no longer be feasible, but we have kind of neo-socialist ideas rising up. In any case, I think these ideological currents within international society do come in and shape politics and shape policies within the region, and it's not completely reducible to material economic conditions. It's partially reducible to material economic conditions, but you learn a lot by taking the ideas as somewhat autonomous and taking them seriously, I think. And so ideas are in part movers. That said, a lot of the revolutionaries just grab onto the ideology because they think it will best enable them to control the state. And it's not like they're deeply believing in these ideologies in all cases. In some they are, but in some, initially they grab onto the ideology for purely strategic reasons. And then once you've committed to an ideology, you can't easily back out of it. You're stuck with it. And so they go forward with it and perhaps come to really believe it over time. I don't know. But I think mainly the revolutionaries want the state and they want to use and organize state power. I'll stop there.
All right. We have a few more minutes. I can say something. I want to say something, but you don't need to answer all of it. You can just take it. So I had many questions that have already been addressed or posed to you, including cases like Venezuela that are problematic and so on and so forth. So I'm going to ask you what's left in my notes. One is I'm puzzled about what the role of this ideological cleavages really is. The way it's presented, like sometimes at least, it seems like, ideological cleavages are always present, right? International ideological cleavages. So if they're always present and they're in that sense trivial, what are they doing? It seems like they are shaping the kind of discourse and program that the revolution has, but I'm not sure if it's producing the revolutionary situation, right? Which is what it's supposedly doing in conjunction with the systemic legitimacy problem, right? So that's a first question. Second, and relatedly, how many revolutionary situations do we have out there? I mean, how? Because I think this story is basically about not necessarily about the causes of revolutionary situations, but about the enablers of the revolution itself, right? So how many revolutionary situations are there? How prevalent are those legitimacy crisis and so on? I think many of the questions that we have about negative cases and so on and so forth would be answered if we had a set of negative cases, following the logic of your article with Gertz, right? Possible versus negative and so on and so forth. I think that would be very helpful. Mm-hmm. That perhaps will help you clarify questions such as the one on Peru. If you want my answer like right now, I would say probably it is a political revolution. However, you said, so Peru, was there something solid that was changed with some other thing? And then that's the problem, because there was nothing and there's never been something solid in Peru for a while. But still, the transition to democracy was in 1979, 1980, and then the autogolpe came in 92. So it's like a little more than 10 years. You know what I mean? Peru is very but still, based on the art definition, I think Peru might be a case. And lastly, I was wondering about this, particularly this thing that you said about revolutions from within, and how a crucial condition was the presence of institutions to mobilize people. I'm assuming that you think that because, these forces will face counter-revolutionary attacks, and you kind of need people to be mobilized, right? Which I'm sympathetic to. However, these revolutions from within, my thinking is that they are going to be centrally moved through voting, which, I don't know, maybe plebiscitarian techniques, plebiscitarian modes of mobilization that do not require that much organization are an alternative too, right? So I'm gonna leave that there, and that's it.
Those are awesome questions, Rodrigo. Thank you so much. It is true that all of politics is marked by, quote, ideological cleavages, but most of those cleavages, I think, are like liberal versus liberal, or conservative versus conservative cleavages. Especially liberal versus liberal cleavages are common. And so, like the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States before Trump, that was just liberal on liberal, that cleavage. As I'm, of course, in the US, we call the Republicans conservatives, but they're not. They're liberals by my definition. At least they were before Trump. And so much of like democratic and competitive electoral politics is a liberal on a liberal. There are situations where it's conservative on conservative in authoritarian situations. And so I need to, you're absolutely right, discuss that more. How normal politics is actors within the same general ideology, fighting it out with one another. And my argument is you get a revolutionary situation and you're on the road toward political revolution when it's not liberal versus liberal, it's liberal versus socialist or liberal versus conservative. And again, this can be measured, and we can look at the actual cases. And you're completely right that I need to look at negative cases. I've started to do some of this, and there's many different kinds of negative cases, and they're interesting. But I think an important set of negative cases will be just these normal politics where the two sides hate each other, but they basically are from the same ideological camp. And it's like in Colombia for much of the 20th century, you have they hate each other and they're fighting with each other, but on the other hand, they're both cut from the same ideological cloth, both sides. Revolutionary situations, they're special in that you definitely have two sides that disagree fundamentally on ideology, and the side that's not in power views the current system as rotten to the core, so that you not only have to remove the government, you have to take down the Constitution and you have to take down the state and rehaul it all and build it back up anew. And that's what defines a revolutionary situation, is the combination of those beliefs along with a real ideological cleavage. And again, I think you're right that another set of negative cases are those cases that have revolutionary situations that don't experience political revolutions. And my theory says that they're structurally blocked from experiencing political revolutions. And but just listing the revolutionary situation cases, like say in Latin America in the 20th century, would be very useful in and of itself. And to see what percentage of revolutionary situations yield to political revolutions. And if they don't, how you get out of a revolutionary situation into something resembling normal politics again without a political revolution. I'm glad that you thought the Peru case was problematic because it didn't have something solid before. That resonates with my sense as well. And for these borderline political revolution cases, I need to come up with a typology of the reasons why they're borderline. And one reason why you can be borderline is the antecedent regime state was incoherent, or relatively incoherent. And so you feel uncomfortable saying that it's a political revolution because you don't know exactly what you're transforming. But I do agree that you're right. Peru, the first case of the third wave of democracy, if we want to call it a democracy, there was definitely and that it had some stability. Then that starts to look a lot like a political revolution. Revolutions from within. Yeah, I mean, the key to them is when the government suddenly is revolutionary and it's trying to tear down the state and tear down the regime and maybe make a new constitution, they're going to have mass support. Otherwise, it will fail. And that mass support, if it's an electoral system, can take the form of voting. And or it can take the form of, if they go the authoritarian route, mass rallies and displays like fascist regimes do, in which it's clear that they have power and you can't overpower them or challenge them. I think eventually, for political revolutions to happen from within, you can't rely on the elections alone. I think my hunch is that if Trump were to make a political revolution in the United States, he would have to mobilize his followers and put down a counter-revolution in some way on the back of his mass supporters. And so I have to look at all of the within revolutions. But my sense is that in each case of elections, mobilizing electoral support would not be enough on its own, because the counter-revolutionaries would use other means to tear down the revolution. And so you have to mobilize mass support to destroy the counter-revolution. That's my sense. This was so much fun. Thank you so much. I learned a great deal, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to present work very much in progress.
Thank you, Jim. And that's all the time we had. So again, I think we're all looking forward to where this is going in the end. And thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Y gracias a todos por venir.